So think about it in Unity. Did you possibly think when you started getting involved in Unity that you were like, the promise of a rose garden, right? Like, I am finally breaking free from the ideas of religiosity where sin and damnation and how awful and awful and awful I am is taught over and over, right? I'm finally free of that into this idea that God is not sitting up on a cloud waiting for me to make a mistake and ready to throw a bolt of lightning into my life, but instead, God is a presence and a power, an energy field and a force of which we are all one, and I can unfold and unflower these roses in this truth. But then you find, don't you, sometimes in Unity, you find that, even though there is a different approach to spiritual practice, it's not all roses, is it? The roses sometimes cover the scent of some things that are underneath. Sometimes you find some thorns. In the post, when Gary suggested this song, he said this. His comment was, Christian spirituality does not promise a rose garden, that everything will be rosy, but that Christian spirituality makes it easy to survive. So he's talking about that practice, that a new thought, that it shifts our experience, it shifts our awareness, it offers a gift, but it doesn't take away the practice, does it? It doesn't take away the idea that we have a part in this, that there is some effort to be made. And in fact, sometimes it seems like it might be easier to have a black and white idea, right? To be able to just go somewhere, and because I went somewhere, everything's better. To just say something, and because I said these words, it's done. Because I repeated something that someone else told me to repeat, I no longer have any other work to do. It's complete. Or because I choose to think something that someone else told me is true, but hasn't come to my heart yet, I can just stop there and be done with asking the questions. It's not always rosy when we wake up to the practice, and recognizing that in Unity and New Thought, the practice is not a once-a-week practice. It's beyond Sundays, isn't it? It's a daily practice, and in fact, it's a practice of moment-by-moment awareness. It's a practice in Unity where we use our minds to activate our good, where we engage in meditation, engage in affirmation, engage in prayer, and that's ours to do. Unity started, many of you know, not as a religion. It wasn't meant to be a religion. It wasn't meant to be organized in some way that we gathered together on Sunday mornings. In fact, they didn't even hold practice time on Sundays because Sunday mornings were reserved to go to your church or temple or wherever you go for your other spiritual practice. But often they were small study groups led by women based on education, based on reading books, reading, writing, giving truth talks, and exploring these principles and seeing how these principles can apply to your everyday life and the rest of your spiritual practice. So education today looks like experiencing Sunday morning. It looks like listening to podcasts, reading new books that are out, and reading old books that are out. It's about exploring and learning and not having limitations. It's about being an open community of learners. It's about keeping conversations open. I was just talking to a friend recently who was telling me about a conversation they had with an evangelical, and I was interested in this conversation, and as she was sharing, she was saying some of her beliefs that were, on the edge, and proposing some of these ideas, and the response she was getting was, interesting idea. And I thought that was just marvelous. To one, have the courage to have a conversation with someone who you believe or think operates in a different mindset than your own, but to be able to engage in a critical thinking conversation in a way that's non-confrontational. So to be able to engage with people in a way that's non-confrontational, but that opens a beginner's mind or an explorer's mind, right? That is a gift. And that's a gift, I think, that comes from when your spiritual practice is in your heart, when you live it and it's in your heart. One of my favorite books is by Paul Ferrini, and it's called I Am the Door. And it's a book, on the teachings of the master teacher. And I don't have it here with me today, but there are parts of it that it goes into how when you have your spiritual practice as an experience, as a living experience, right? Things don't threaten it. You know what I mean? Like you don't have to defend it. You don't have to, quote it or find out where it's written because it just is, right? It can't be taken away. It's living in you. And I just marveled at this experience because I thought how beautiful that the individual was just, interesting idea to think about. I was listening to NPR, and one of the daughters from Westboro Baptist Church, if you don't know about that, it's a very conservative and judgmental and hellfire damnation, anti-gay, which is anti-human, place. And so they put a lot of effort and energy into preaching that message. And she was just immersed in this. She was just immersed in it and all of the issues of today that go along with this theology and this teaching and this consciousness. And she was on NPR talking about her transformation. And she said that her transformation and her emancipation from limited thinking and from the thinking that actually pressed out love came from not the counterattacks that she would get, that she knew this stuff. She was trained in this stuff. And she would preach it and she would give all of her justifications. But her transformation came when real people, loving, compassionate, kind people, kept engaging her in common sense and conscious dialogue. And that through engaging her in questions and in thinking and just in a basic human-to-human, heart-to-heart level of conversation, level of connecting, she started questioning her own beliefs. She started questioning the limitations of her own religious education. And she started questioning her God and which God she was connecting to, the God of her religious education or a God of expansive love. And in that, her healing happened, and she was transformed. She came out of that mindset and out of that thinking. But it happened through being opened. It happened through questions. It happened through steady kindness and human interaction. We have another beloved in this community that gets together and has engaging conversations with a whole bunch of others from different theological perspectives and always brings the unity perspective to just enrich the conversation. Not necessarily that anyone's mind's going to be changed, but just to be present there, to know the conversations that are going on. How many of us listen to the other conversations that are unlike our own? So that we're aware, that we're engaged, and that we're in fact open to even hearing other expressions, other ideas that might expand our consciousness, that might bring us to the edge and have us go, wait, I was living in a box and I never even realized I was living in a box. I had something that could expand, but I didn't even think. I thought I was the expanded one. I didn't even realize that I had stopped thinking or stopped growing or stopped questioning because I thought I was all done. In Unity, we teach that this practice is about practical application. It's about our own healing work, our own awareness. It's about clearing. It's about forgiving. It's about not repeating the same errors or traditionally called sin, missing the mark, not repeating the same errors over and over and just saying, oops, 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 but inviting in a shift so that we can expand and grow, not repeat and clear, repeat and clear, repeat and clear. The practice is to get a better understanding of ourselves and get a better understanding of others, to learn consciousness, to learn how we learn, to listen to our body, to listen to the words our minds speak, to listen to our emotions, but not to be controlled. not to be told what to do or told what to think. Ernest Holmes, the founder of Science of Mind, said, "Even the spirit does not seek to control us. It lets us alone to discover ourselves." We live in an interactive universe. What our consciousness brings, what our consciousness says, what our consciousness does is creating in every moment. Eric Butterworth, one of Unity's most known teachers, says it this way. He talks about the effect of your consciousness, and I think this is one of the big keys for Unity students. It's looking at what our consciousness is and the effect of it, and recognizing that it makes a difference. He says this: if you begin with the principle that you might as well face it, then you're done before you begin. If you think of yourself as only human, then you've totally ruled out the idea of the divine process of you, which is the reality of you. I think a lot of folks have settled for less than their better selves, usually out of conformity, usually out of rationalization, usually out of an attitude of self-limitation. This is just the way I am. It's not the way you are, but if you think it's the way you are, then it's the way you will be as far as you're concerned. That's what consciousness is. You can expand your awareness and see yourself in a larger context. Suddenly, you open up to a whole new universe for yourself. And so Jesus then says, all things are possible to them that believe. All things. Can you believe that? All things. He goes on to say, all things are possible, perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, because it takes us a while to wake up, but all things are possible. Whatever is whole. Whether you see that wholeness or whether you experience that wholeness or not, that's the marvelous principle to relate to in terms of yourself. So the unity path and the unity practice is about waking up to this wholeness, expanding our concepts. In Luke 12:32, it says, it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. That it is your source's great pleasure to give you the dominion, to give you the understanding, to give you the wisdom, to give you the love, to give you the knowledge, to give you what has already been given because you are one with it. It can't be given and taken away because it is already existent here. So when we're in the practice is about allowing ourselves to have an ever-expanding concept of God and an ever-evolving experience of God. This practice is not something that is stagnant. It's alive. It's not something that can be written about once and be done with. It's not something that we can absorb on a Sunday and then turn off for the rest of the week. It's not something that if we are practicing it and we don't find ourselves being challenged or ideas of self or God consciousness expanding, we're not blowing our own selves out of the water going, whoa, then we might not be working the practice to the degree we could. We are here to have an ever-expanding concept of God, a concept of God that doesn't limit God. An ever-expanding experience of God, an evolving experience of God, a practicing the presence experience of God. Butterworth talks about these ideas of God, and one of the injuries that people tend to have in experiences of religious abuse is that they wake up to feeling like someone put something in their way. Someone put a roadblock in the way to experiencing the fullness of what was available to them. You fill in the blank, whatever it is, but someone taught me something or said something or showed me something that was actually a barricade. So in Unity, we strive to just simply omit barricades. And of course, we have our own things that will come into play because the mind does that, right? The mind can put things in the way. But the idea is to keep removing the barricades, to keep expanding the ideas, so that our limited ideas, the ideas that our mind can conceive of, do not cut off the edges of God, the space where there are no edges, where there's only existence from center to circumference. So Eric Butterworth talks about the idea and the awakening to God as principle. And he says this when he talks about God as principle. He says it's so important to get to the realization of God as principle, not as a person, not as present somewhere, but God as a principle. People say, well, that's too cold or impersonal for me. And some have said they've taken my Lord away. The fact is, they may take your Lord away if your Lord has been someone who sits off there somewhere in the universe. They may have taken away your anthropomorphic God, but then given you presence. Remember, Ralph Waldo Emerson says, a beautiful thought that's always been inspiring to me. He says, when you've broken with the God of tradition and ceased from the God of the intellect, then God fires you with his presence. He goes on to say, when you stop dealing with relating to, pleading to, supplicating from something somewhere out there and get involved in the realization of the wholeness of life, then suddenly you become immersed in the presence of God. No longer do you believe in God. Instead, you have a believing attitude that is based on the presence of God. Instead, you have a believing attitude that is based on the presence of God. He goes on to say, you do not believe in it, something that's this symbolic gesture of the whole, but you believe, and your believing attitude is based upon the realization of the activity of God, which is present. The activity of God, which is present. When we go down that path, it is a path of questions. It is a path of exploring. It is a path of discovery. And we often, sometimes in spiritual practice, get so stumped because we're asking questions and we don't have the answers. And for some people, that means they stop asking the questions. But we can actually live in the question. We can actually approach a question without a need for an answer, but letting the question itself evolve. But a lot of spiritual practice stops short because we get stumped. And so we just stop asking. Think about the questions you asked yourself when you were a child. Eric Butterworth talks about this example of a 9-year-old little child going to Sunday school and going deep with the questions. And the people around that child not having the answers. When you allow yourself to live the questions, you become the answer. You stop looking for it outside of yourself and you let it expand from within you. Sometimes we don't have the answers, so we shun the questions. Has anyone had that experience? Where you were shunned for asking the questions? Rather than humbly sitting in the presence of not knowing the answer, you criticize the questioner. Criticize the one who's exploring because it's uncomfortable. It's uncomfortable. Or sometimes systems make up answers. They make up answers based on limitations, based on separation, based on hierarchy, based on the need for dominion, based on ignorance, based on a desire for power or to feed an agenda, whatever it is. Maybe it's just based on insecurity, but we make up answers for something and we try to fit a great God and a great good into a limitation. When we get into God as principle, God is everywhere present, we open the door. And that is the purpose of New Thought. That's the purpose of unity, to open the door and to keep the door open not to find limited concepts to fit our already existent ideas, but to allow our ideas to keep evolving and to keep expanding, to create a container that doesn't hold in, but that facilitates growth and awakening. This always leads to the most important part of the practice, which is actually practicing the presence. Because everything else, right? Everything else is just mental entertainment. It's emotional entertainment. It's ideas. It's thinking. It's exploring. It's engaging. Sometimes it's entertaining. But all of this is just to bring us to the practice. Eric Butterworth says, Brother Lawrence, a 17th century Carmelite monk, coined the phrase, the practice of the presence of God, many hundreds of years ago. It's a term that's been very interesting and very helpful to a lot of people. I love it myself. But you see, the practice of the presence does not necessarily mean feeling something special or receiving flashes of sight or sound or having these intuitive senses of the infinite process or cosmic awareness. It doesn't necessarily imply meditating throughout a long period of time. This is not essentially what is implied by the practice of the presence. We can make it seem too complicated and thus totally eliminate the possibility of practice. He goes on to say, to practice the presence is to live constantly as if you believe that the allness of God were present in all its totality at every point in space. This means it's present in you, in every experience of your life and every function of your body. That's the practice of the presence. He goes on to say the practice of the presence of God has very little to do with those few moments when you study or have your meditation. Obviously, that's part of it, but it's so much more than that. The practice of the presence means what you do with your life. Like the practice of medicine is what the doctor does for a living. What do you do? Oh, I practice the presence. Do you? Are you practicing it when you worry? Are you practicing it when you're fuming and fretting because you missed a subway? Are you practicing the presence when you go off to work and you just feel terribly anxious because the boss has asked you to come in and have a talk with him? Are you really practicing the presence? He goes on to say the practice of the presence is to live constantly as if you really believe that the allness of God, the divine potential for wholeness, were present within you. You believe this with every part and parcel of your life, every concern of you, every experience of your involvement with people, in every function of your body. To believe it and to act as if you believe it. That takes some time. So when we talk about practical metaphysics, we imply very seriously that there's a lot of practice to be done. So it's not a pill, it's not a prescription, it's not a pick up a Sunday ticket and I'm done. It's not necessarily easy, but it's worth it. There's a Maori proverb that says, turn your face to the sun and the shadows will fall behind you. That's the practice. Namaste.